Hi everyone. We're coming in a little early today because we want to give you early birds a nice preview. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here while we wait for the rest of the people to join us and show you Kenny's last video called Licking Bees and Pulping Trees, the Reign of the Wasp Queen.
As the April sun rises on a pile of firewood, something royal stirs inside. This wasp queen is one of thousands who mated in late autumn and hibernated through the winter. Now she emerges into the spring air to begin her reign. Most of her sisters didn't so lucky. While hibernating in compost piles and underground burrows, many sleeping queens were eaten by spiders. Warm winters caused by climate change led other queens to emerge early, only to find there was no available food. Some queens that survived the winter fell victim to the threats of spring, such as carnivorous plants, birds, and man-made pesticides. Our queen is the lone survivor of her old hive, and now she must become the foundress of a new one. But first, breakfast. The queen heads for a citrus grove full of honeybee hives. The bees can be dangerous if provoked, but right now they're paralyzed by the morning cold. Their hairy bodies are dripping with sugar water from an earlier feeding, and the resourceful queen licks them for a morning snack. Newly energized, our queen searches for a safe nesting area. This tree hollow, safe from rain, wind, and predators, is ideal. She chews the surrounding wood and plant fibers to make a paper-like pulp. Then she builds around 50 brood cells that comprise the beginning of her nest. Using sperm stored from last fall, the queen lays a fertilized egg into each cell, producing as many as 12 in 20 minutes. Within a week, these will hatch into female larvae, but until then, the queen must hunt down smaller insects to feed her brood, all while expanding the hive, laying eggs, and defending against intruders. Fortunately, our queen is well prepared. Unlike bees, wasps can sting as many times as they need to. With such a busy schedule, the queen barely has time to feed herself. Luckily, she doesn't have to. When she feeds an insect to her grubs, they digest the bug into a sugary substance that sustains their mother. By the end of July, these first larvae have matured into adult workers, ready to take on foraging, building, and defense. The queen can now lay eggs full-time, sustaining herself on the workers' spoils and their unfertilized eggs. Although each worker only lives for roughly 3 weeks, the queen's continuous egg-laying swells their ranks. In just one summer, the nest reaches the size of a basketball, supporting thousands of workers. Such a large population needs to eat, and the nearby garden provides a veritable buffet. As the swarm descends, alarmed humans try to swat them. They even fight back with pesticides that purposefully poison wasps and inadvertently impact a wide range of local wildlife. But the wasps are actually vital to this ecosystem. Sitting at the top of the local invertebrate food chain, these insects keep spiders, mites, and centipedes in check. Wasps consume crop-eating insects, making them particularly helpful for farms and gardens. They even pollinate fruits and vegetables, and help winemakers by biting into their grapes and jump-starting fermentation. This feast continues until autumn, when the foundress changes course. She begins grooming some eggs into a new generation of queens, while also laying unfertilized eggs that will mature into reproductive males called drones. This new crop of queens and males requires more food, but with summer over, the usual sources run dry, and the foraging wasps start taking more aggressive risks. By September, the hive's organization deteriorates. Hungry workers no longer clean the nest, and various scavengers move in. Just when it seems the hive can no longer sustain itself, the fertile queens and their drones depart in a massive swarm. As the days grow colder, the workers starve, and our queen reaches the end of her lifespan. But above, a swarm of reproductive wasps has successfully mated. The males die off shortly after, but the newly fertilized queens are ready to find shelter for their long sleep, and this woodpile looks like the perfect place to spend the winter. Over 1/3 of America's food is produced thanks to bees pollinating its crops. But in the past decade, bees have been disappearing at an alarming rate. Where have all the bees gone? And what happens if they're gone for good? Learn more about the phenomenon known as colony collapse disorder with this video.
Hello, everybody, and I sure hope a lot of you enjoyed that preview video that we started with today. It's called Licking Bees and Pulping Trees. It's a TED Ed video by none other than our presenter today, Kenny Coogan, which I'm so happy to have here. Kenny is my partner, and I'm very excited about introducing him today for tonight's webinar. So let me get started. First of all, Kenny and I, we, along with about 70 other teachers, we are the Teacher Institute for Evolutionary Science. You can learn more about us at tieseducation.org. We provide free resources for teachers to more effectively teach natural selection, evolution, adaptation, and all of these important concepts. I want to share with you, I have put it in the chat room and I'll put it in there again, that Kenny's book is for sale at the link that I provided in the chat. It's a great book. I have it here. And he so generously offered today to donate his proceeds to TIES, which is a nonprofit education organization. Finally, if you have questions, there's a box in the bottom that says ask a question, and we will be asking Kenny questions at the end of his talk. So for those of you who don't know this awesome guy, Kenny Coogan is a science and agriculture teacher in Tampa, Florida. He also is a food, farm, and flower columnist for multiple magazines and has published over 400 articles. Wow, he's as busy as that wasp and we just saw in the video, which was exhausting. Coogan leads workshops about owning chickens, vegetable gardening, animal training, and corporate team building on his homestead, not to mention TIES workshops. His newest gardening book, 99.5 Homesteading Poems, is now available, as I mentioned in the chat. Kenny has a Florida State nursery license and sells carnivorous plants throughout Central Florida. I think I want one, Kenny, by the way, by the end of this talk.
Great.
So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over now to Kenny, and I will be coming back later to help him answer his questions by leading the question and answer section of this workshop webinar.
Okay. Sounds good. Can you see that?
Not yet. I can see
All
you
right.
and your wonderful tie shirt and all those wonderful plants you have behind you too.
Great.
Now we can.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Bertha. And I wanted to tell you first about my interest in carnivorous plants. And it started when I was in 10th grade. The hall monitor of our school came into the biology class and he talked about carnivorous plants. And I was the only student out of 220 that showed interest. And the next day he gifted me 2 carnivorous plants, which I shortly killed within about a month. So then I went off to college and I met like-minded people and they also had an interest in carnivorous plants. And I said, oh, I know just the person to contact. So we went to Mr. Herman's house. And in addition to carnivorous plants, he really liked daylilies. And he taught us how to hybridize daylilies. And he also taught us a lot about carnivorous plants. And with his help, I started the Western New York Carnivorous Plant Club. So that's him there. And there's me airing out myself on a hot summer New York day as we learn how to hybridize plants. And it was just a pity that people didn't take him up on this, jackpot of knowledge. And people just kind of dismissed him because he was the hall monitor, but he knew a lot about botanical and horticulture. So what he taught me was what a carnivorous plant was. And I worked at zoos and aquariums for about 10 years, and people would always come up to me and say, What is a penguin? I know what a bird is, I know what a mammal is, but what is a penguin? And the same question kind of applies to carnivorous plants. People say, I know what an animal is, I know what a plant is, but what is a carnivorous plant? And indeed, a carnivorous plant is a plant. They also photosynthesize just like any other plant. So that means they get their energy from the sun. And all carnivorous plants are angiosperms, which means they produce a flower. And scientists vaguely categorize a carnivorous plant with these three ideas. They have to lure and capture prey, they have to be able to digest the prey, and they have to benefit from the nutrients of the prey. And some plants, like thistles and even tomatoes, they do maybe one or two of these three things, but not all. So that's why we don't consider them a carnivorous plant. So when I do this presentation at school, I ask, can anyone name a species of a carnivorous plant? And I usually get about 2 answers. The first, of course, is the Venus flytrap, and then the second would be a pitcher plant. And way back in 1875, Charles Darwin wrote the book Insectivorous Plants, where he talked about sundews and Venus flytraps. So that was quite a while ago. And today we know that there's at least 12 genera and between 750 to 1,000 species of carnivorous plants. And the average layperson can name about 1, maybe 2. So in 1875, when Charles Darwin published his book, people did not like the idea that plants would eat meat because that would upset the order and, the order of life. And back in 1875, if you wanted to show disgust of an idea, you would write a nasty poem. Unlike people going on Twitter and social media, people fled, or they went to the Gardener's Chronicle, this publication in England, and they wrote a page-long poem about how disgusted they were that Charles Darwin thought that plants could eat meat. And this is just the last line. And it talks about how sad it would be if their dog would stumble upon a violet and then the violet would cause the dog death. So obviously they didn't really understand carnivory and plants in 1875, and today people are still confused. So we have the Venus flytrap, the most popular one. Up there we have a sundew, which Darwin loved. On the bottom we have a North American pitcher. This is called a California pitcher. We have a dewy pine, Australian and Asian pitcher plants. On the bottom right is a Aldrovanda, which is an aquatic Venus flytrap with a snap trap. We have butterworts, bladderworts, heliconia, which are plants that live up in Venezuela. And unfortunately, there's no plants that are large enough to eat humans. The biggest plant that eats an animal is about the size, the prey is about the size of a rat or a small bird. So we classified these different species by their trap type. Some of them are pitfall, some of them are adhesive, like flypaper, some of them snap trap, like the most famous ones. Others vacuum up their prey, and then others use a lobster pot trap. Now, carnivorous plant evolution is pretty sparse. This is one of a few, I think there's only a handful of carnivorous plant fossils. This might be the only one of a leaf. The others are of just carnivorous plant seeds, and that's because in order to get a lot of fossils, you need to have a lot of conditions right. You need to have usually a hard part like a nail, tooth, or claw, and carnivorous plants don't have that, and the environment has to be right. We know that carnivorous plants lived a long time ago. We know that they're in acidic, boggy conditions, and that's about it because of the fossil record. But we do, of course, know that those that were able to supplement and get nutrients from bugs were able to survive in these acidic conditions. And acidic soil reduces greatly or prevents plants from soaking up nutrients from their roots. So plants that aren't carnivorous, they would have the disadvantage. And plants that were able to get nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium from other sources were able to thrive. We know that carnivorous plants are all angiosperms. And we know angiosperms are between 60 and 125 million years old. We know that carnivorous plants happened after insects, and that makes sense if they're eating insects. The insects had to evolve first. And we know that carnivorous plants or carnivorian plants evolved several times, probably 7 or 8 different times. And this is my favorite fact of the entire presentation, because even though I'm talking about carnivorous plants, they're not really related to each other. They don't have a common ancestor, but they all have this really cool adaptation. So a lot of people who learn about carnivorous plants want to grow them and care for them. And these are 3 general tips for caring for carnivorous plants. These are this will cover most of the plants that you're going to be finding at nurseries. The first one is to flood them. They like to sit in water. And I have what's called the tray method. So I have lots of trays where they're just sitting in water for the majority of the time, if not year round. And the water needs to be pure. So that means distilled water, reverse osmosis water, or rainwater. And I have because I do have a nursery, I have a little more than 1,000 carnivorous plants right now. And I have 5 50-gallon rain barrels. And that is sufficient for me to get through the year without buying reverse osmosis water or distilled water. Because most of them are native to bogs and swamps. That's why they like to be flooded. They like to have their roots wet. The second thing is they do not respond well to fertilizers. If you fertilize them like a normal plant, there'll be a lot of burning on the leaves and the roots, and they'll die pretty quickly. And then the last thing is you don't really want to play with their traps, because even though they can move pretty fast, when you play with their traps, you're just wasting their energy. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that for this one. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the different genera of carnivorous plants. And the first one, of course, is the most famous one, the Venus flytrap, Dionaea muscipula. Muscipula means mousetrap, and Dionaea was named after Venus's daughter, or Venus, the daughter of Dione and Jupiter. So back in the 1760s, the governor of the Carolinas, Arthur Dobbs, he didn't discover, but he made it popular by calling it the fly trap sensitive, and he sent it over to England. And Carl Linnaeus did not believe that plants were carnivorous at that time, and he did not believe that the Venus flytrap was carnivorous. He did recognize that it would snap shut when things touched it, but he thought maybe that the insects were just hiding in the trap. And this bottom right picture is the Venus flytrap's flowers, which of course are less known. In the entire world, or in the entire galaxy, Venus flytraps can only be found in one place, and that's about a 100-mile radius of Wilmington, North Carolina. And they are vulnerable, so they're not endangered anymore, but they are vulnerable, and that's mostly due to poaching and habitat destruction. People are draining the swamp and building condos and large houses. And another reason why they're not doing great is because people are stopping naturally occurring wildflowers, and the fires would keep the shrubs and the understory back, but because they're preventing the wildfires, the taller trees are shading in the Venus flytraps, and Venus flytraps really like sunny locations. So that's another reason why they're vulnerable. Charles Darwin loved Venus flytraps, and he called them one of the most wonderful plants in the world. He did lots of experiments, which he wrote in that book. He was able to paralyze the leaves by doing different incisions. He was able to anesthetize them temporarily, and he was the first person to figure out scientifically that Venus flytraps were carnivorous. And if you go back to the previous slide, you'll see that this is 110 years later than the discovery of the Venus flytrap. So it took 110 years to convince people that the Venus flytrap did indeed eat meat. So the way that they work is, if you think about your hands being the 2 lobes, on each lobe there's 2 to 4 hairs, and one hair has to be triggered twice within 20 seconds. And that sends an electrical signal to the other lobe, and that causes water to get moved around in the lobes, and it causes the outside to fill up with water, the inside gets rid of the water, and that causes that snapping motion. And on the inside of the lobes are glands that produce digestive enzymes, and these enzymes are the same enzymes that non-carnivorous plants produce when they're being munched on by herbivores or being munched on by insects. So I personally don't think it's a big leap to figure out that same acid. You start with a non-carnivorous plant being munched on, and then Venus flytraps, they just produce a ton of this, and the acid that used to be defense is now offense. So they're using this chemical to digest the bugs. The more the animal struggles, the more tightly the lobes close. And for Venus flytraps, it takes between 4 and 10 days for them to be able to digest their food. And earlier I mentioned you don't really want to play too much with their traps, and that's because each trap can only open and close 3 times in their life. So if you look at the picture on the left, you'll see that there's about 10 traps. A couple of them are blackening, and that's because they're near their end. They've opened and closed 3 times and they're dying. They're a leaf, so they'll die. You can cut them off. And in the center, there's going to be new growth. So over here on the right, there's maybe 20 traps. So that means this plant can eat 60 times, and after it eats 60 times, it's not done. It's going to keep producing more leaves. But if you set them all off at the same time and then it can't eat anything, it is going to weaken the plant at least a little bit. Now, there's only one species of carnivorous plants, or Venus flytraps rather. So that means all of the different types of Venus flytraps you see are called cultivars, which stands for cultivated varieties. So there's only one species and the one genus of Venus flytrap, and people saw one that was a little bigger, a little redder, a little more purple, and they kept it and they kept breeding that, and that's how you get cultivars. So this one looks like a typical, this is the typical wild type Venus flytrap. And people took this, and you can see how this has beautiful long lashes, and then they found one that had tiny teeth, and they called it dente. And this is a great example of artificial selection. People found one that was a little more funnel shaped, and they created this one. People found a mutant that had fused cilia or fused teeth, and they called it fused tooth. And then this one, B52, is one of the monsters. The traps can get about 2 to 2.5 inches wide, and it is not named after the bomber or the band. It is named after the person's naming system. So he had A1, A2, A3, A4, and eventually when he got to B52, he was happy with the size and the color, and he named it B52. And the last one I wanted to show you was red dragon, where not only the inside is red-purple, but also the outside of the lobes. To care for Venus flytraps, the soil needs to be 1 part sand, 1 part peat. They like to be sitting in water year-round. They like to have a low water table, which means they like to be sitting in 1/8 of distilled water or rainwater year-round. If you give them too much, the roots will rot out. If you dry them out, they'll also die. They like a lot of sun. The more sun you can give them, the redder they become. And they do like to experience the changes of weather. So if you keep them outside, I'm in Tampa, Florida, so I keep them outside year round. If it freezes a couple of times, they're fine. They can handle down to the 20s. They do okay in windowsills, but they still like winter dormancies where they can rest, and they do best without fertilizer. And each of the genera that we're going to cover, you can see this little logo, Critter Companions by Kenny Coogan. If you visit kennycoogan.com, I have each of these tables on my website that you can check out, because most of these tables are going to look very similar, so I'm going to go by them pretty fast. So the next group that I wanted to talk about were the Sundews, or the Drosera. And I love how they have these little heart-shaped leaves, and these are leaves that are unfurling. And there's about 200 species of Sundews. They're found all over the world, and they're closely related to Venus flytraps and Aldrovanda, which is that aquatic Venus flytrap type plant. In the 1860s, somebody wrote a letter to Lyell, And he said, "For at this present moment, I care more about Drosera than the origin of all the species in the world." And I bet you can guess who this was. But he will not publish on Drosera till next year, for I am frightened and astounded at my results. Is it not curious that a plant should be far more sensitive to a touch than any nerve in the human body? Yet I am sure, perfectly sure, that this is true. Yours most truly obliged, C. Darwin. So Charles Darwin, he liked to experiment and play with the sundews, and this is 1860, and he didn't publish that book until 1875. So sundews, they come in two types, stalked and sessile. Stalked means they have these stalks, sessile means they're flat. And if you look on the top left, you'll see that some sundews do move. They will move their stalked fly paper traps around the bug so they can get more coverage, but that stop motion is over the course of 45 minutes, so they're a pretty slow moving plant. And if you're interested in getting a carnivorous plant, I would recommend this over a Venus flytrap and other carnivorous plants. The Cape sundew, which is from South Africa, they make great beginner carnivorous plants because in South Africa, the temperatures go between 45 and 90 degrees, and you can keep these plants indoors or outdoors for much of the country. They grow year-round, unlike other plants that need a dormancy period, so you feel good year-round. Unlike those plants that go dormant, you get nervous that they're dying or dead. The bottom left, this is the wild type. This is what they look like in the wild. And then above that is the pink type. Over to the right is the all red, and then the bottom is the all green. And these get pretty big, maybe 5, 6, 7 inches tall, several plants, and they do move a little bit when they're fed or when they catch a bug. Another type of sundews are the rosetted types. This bottom right one is pretty popular that you can find at a lot of nurseries. It's called Drosera spatulata. They only get 1 to 3 inches in width, but they do create stalks of flowers, and then they seed, they self-seed, and they also create little pups. So you could have lots of those. Other carnivorous plants include the temperate ones, which are from England and also here in Florida. All of these are native to Florida, although they die back all the way to this little hibernacula, which is this little resting winter bud, which doesn't look like much, so you might get nervous. I think a lot of times people throw their carnivorous plants out in the winter, thinking that they're dead, but they're actually just dormant. Another group is the tuberous sundews, which can grow to great heights, several meters. And then there's the opposite, which are the pygmies. And here's a little European penny, and you can see the size of these full-grown, adorable sundews. There's also the woolly sundews, which are a little harder to take care of. And then these are really beautiful. These look great as a hanging basket, the fork-leaf sundews, where they kind of look like the staghorn. So if you wanted to propagate sundews, one way you could do is just by pulling off their leaves and then suspending them in some pure water, or you could place them on top of sphagnum moss and fill the container up so water is just on top of the sphagnum, just covering the leaf, and then let the water slowly evaporate. And then that leaf will start sending out shoots, as you can see here on the bottom picture. So sundews, you can grow them exactly like Venus flytraps, but I would just put a little bit more water, let them sit in a little bit more water because they like it a little wetter. The next group that I wanted to talk about was Pinguicula, which means the greasy ones or butterworts. And they are carnivorous, but people probably grow them because of their flowers. And I do have one up there, which I can show you in a little bit. There's about 80 species, and a few years ago, I was lucky enough to go to Iceland, and I was really surprised that everywhere we pulled the van over, we could see wild butterworts. And a place that's volcanic, cold, you wouldn't think of carnivorous plants, but they were definitely thriving there. So same thing with butterworts compared to the sundews. They could be stalked or sessile, and in the bottom video, you can see that little bug shaking the camera because he's struggling. It's just like flight paper, they get stuck. And I did see a question before we started, how do these plants lure their food? And it's because they have different scents. So depending on the plant and the prey, some of their scents are musty, some of them are sweet, some of them are sugary. So that's how they attract their prey. And then they create these digestive enzymes that are sticky and catch their food. Butterworts, same thing. You can grow them just like sundews or Venus flytraps. They do benefit from some frequent overhead watering because their leaves will be covered in fungus gnats and fruit flies. So if you overwater them, that kind of rinses them off and then they can catch their food another day. So the next group is one of my favorites, and this is a picture from one of my plants with a little spider hanging off to the side. And this next group is called Sarracenia, which are the North American pitcher plants. In 1576, the first one was discovered and written about. It was called Sarracenia minor, and this is the picture of that. It was discovered in the panhandle of Florida. And then a long time later, in the 1700s, the next species of Sarracenia was discovered, which is Sarracenia purpurea. And it was named, this genus is named after the medical doctor of Quebec at the time in the 1700s. And then you might be able to guess what happened in 1887, which is, several hundred years after 1576. In 1887, scientists figured out that they ate bugs. So again, it took them a while to figure out that the bugs weren't just resting or swimming, they were actually being eaten by the plants. So here's a map of the range of Sarracenia. There's only one species up in Canada. Florida has the most. We have 6 different species. There's 8 species total, but there's lots of naturally occurring hybrids. They are a perennial. They take 5 to 8 years to mature. The ones up in Canada only reach a couple of inches, whereas others can grow over 3 feet tall. And Florida, because I do a lot of presentations in Florida, Florida has the most carnivorous plants, period, and we also have the most Sarracenia in our state. And if you're going to grow Sarracenia, be prepared for them to die back, to hibernate from Thanksgiving to Valentine's Day. And I know Bertha is in Miami. If she's going to grow them, I would dig them up, cut off their leaves, and put the rhizome into a plastic bag, put that in your fridge from Thanksgiving to Valentine's Day, and then wake them up, because that resting period will keep them growing strong and healthy. They flower in the spring, but before they flower, they'll send up these leaves, which are these false pitchers that haven't opened up. And scientists believe that the reason why they do this is so they don't eat their own pollinators. These are the beautiful flowers that are a few inches above the false pitchers. And then as the season progresses, the flowers are pollinated and they close up, and then the traps open and then they start eating bugs. What I've noticed is that Sarracenia really like ants and wasps and moths. The flowers smell pleasant. Here's a couple of different popular Sarracenia that you can get. Some of them have this lacework. Some of them are more horizontal. And in 1870, when they figured out that these were indeed eating bugs, scientists came up with the different zones of carnivory. So the top zone is the attraction zone. It's bright, it's colorful, and it does produce nectar that attracts the bug. The second zone is the conduction zone, and that has some downward facing hairs. So when the bugs travel down, they're slurping up the nectar. When they travel down, they're touching these hairs, and then when they turn around, they get poked in the abdomen, they get poked in the eye by the hairs, and it doesn't feel good, so they keep going further down. That third zone is called the glandular zone, which is very slippery, and it produces those digestive enzymes, which makes it also slippery. And then that fourth zone is the digestion zone, where they fall into a mixture of digestive enzymes and rainwater, the bugs break down, and then they get dissolved through the leaf. And you'll see on the right side, this plant actually has 5 zones, and that's because this one, Sarracenia purpurea, is the only one that has 5 zones. All the other species have the 4 zones. So something that's great if you're a teacher or if you have a carnivorous plant at home is in the fall, you can do a dissection because the leaves are gonna die back brown anyways. So you can cut off the leaves, you can cut them vertically, and you can see this beautiful layers, little lasagna of their meals over the course of the season. So you see all these exoskeletons of wasps and bees and beetles and everything that your plant ate. So they are a pitfall trap. The bugs fall down. One species, Sarracenia flava, which gets quite tall, on the throat, which is the back part of this lid, it does produce this chemical called conine, which makes the bug or the victim or the prey a little bit drunk. It causes them paralysis, and then it causes them to slip down into the pitcher even easier. Now, this picture and this picture are both pictures of my plants, and you'll see that these spiders are hanging out, and spiders and frogs will sit on there. They'll propel themselves down, catch their, and basically just steal the food from the pitcher plant. North American pitcher plants, same thing as the other plants that we've talked about. They like to be sitting in water year-round, and all of this is on my website. The next group of carnivorous plants that are kind of lumped together for no other reason other than they're aquatic are these 3. You have the bladderworts, the water wheel, and the corkscrew plant. In the 1800s, this person, her name is that, and she, I don't think she was even interested in carnivorous plants, but somebody liked how she was philanthropic and she was a teacher in France, so they named the genus after her. And these are the corkscrew plants. They're 2 to 6 inches in length, and this is where they're found. And because of where they're found, their conservation, unlike the Venus flytrap, is very good. And that's because they're found in places where it's hard to get to. So the corkscrew plant, discovered in 1880s, and this to me is also really fun. In 1998, scientists figured out that they were carnivorous. And some of you were born after that year, which is to think, shortly after that year. So it's amazing to think how just recently, like how we're still figuring out carnivory in plants. So this is what the corkscrew plant looks like. It's pretty, non-glorious on the top. And then these things down here are actually subterranean or aquatic leaves. They're not roots, and they spiral down. Here's a picture of it magnified, and this is why they're called corkscrew, the Gymlesia genus. And the bugs, little aquatic bugs, little water fleas, little bugs like that, they'll be swimming around, and then they get vacuumed up into this corkscrew. There's little hairs that prevent them from escaping. The bug travels upward until they reach this chamber that does not have oxygen. They asphyxiate, and then the plant absorbs the bug like that, which are super fascinating. So the next aquatic group are the bladderworts. This is the most prolific genus. There's over 200 species. Some of them are aquatic, some of them are semi-aquatic, some of them terrestrial. They can be found everywhere. Some of them are epiphytes, which means some of them, grow up in the trees. Some of them only live on waterfalls. So the traps are down here. They're the size of a pinhead to the size of a BB pellet, about a ½ inch. People also grow these mostly for their flowers. And in 1797, a scientist named Sowerby wrote about them. In the mid-1800s, different botanists examined them. In 1875, Ferdinand Kahn put water fleas, Daphnia, in a petri dish overnight. He came in the next morning and he saw all the water fleas in the bladders of the bladderworts. He called his good friend Charles Darwin, and Charles Darwin agreed that the water fleas were forcing themselves into the bladders for protection. And this was over in Germany and England. But 2 years earlier, a woman, Mary Treat, in America, wrote a letter to Charles Darwin about how bladderworts are carnivorous. And right before she died, she donated all of her letters and all of her artifacts to a museum in New Jersey. And the museum is looking for an author to write about her life because she was a great naturalist. So this is what Charles Darwin wrote. Mystery of New Jersey has been more successful than any other observer, Darwin said in the section of insectivorous plants, which was talking about the bladderworts. But she also studied the sex lives of butterflies. She also studied sundews. So she was an overall naturalist. And here's an actual picture of a bladderwort with these little hairs. They're floating around in the water. They scientists don't really know how they lead the prey to the bladder, but when the prey touches these trigger hairs, they get swept up into the bladder. Water gets pushed out after about 20 minutes, and then all that's left is the bug, and the bladder, digests it. It pushes in digestive enzymes, then it breaks down the bug, and then it reopens after a couple of hours. And here you can see the little bugs stuck in the bladders. In Florida, we have a lot of bladderworts. I visited Gainesville, UF, and all of this brown stuff, these are all bladderworts. All right, the last plant that I'm going to talk about are pretty interesting because they can but they can cure, they can help minor burns. They can be used as an eye wash. They can be used for drinking water. They can be used as a asthma relief, and they can even help with childbirth. And that plant would be the Asian pitcher plant. So what I was talking about earlier was people native to Southeast Asia use these plants for all of those things. The people in that area use the roots of Nepenthes for upset stomachs, diarrhea, bloating, to reduce fevers. And people in that region also cut off the traps and stuff them with rice and different meats and use them as little bowls, serving bowls. There's a little more than 100 species of Nepenthes, and there's at least 150 species that co-inhabit, that live together, that benefit symbiotically with Nepenthes. So here we have a bat, we have ants living inside the stem, we have frogs and crab spiders living inside the pitchers, and then we have this little hammer ant that if a predator comes near, the hammer ant will start banging on the lid to get rid of the animal that's about to eat the pitcher. Scientists think that what's the benefit for the pitcher plant is that these animals, the frog, the spider, crab, the ants, all the insects, they might go down into the bottom of the pitcher and steal food, but when they're stealing the food, they're pretty messy eaters. They'll eat it, they break it up, and then by just breaking it up, they're making the digestion process easier. You'll also notice that a lot of these, see how these have these lids that cover right over the pitcher, and that is to prevent a lot of rainwater from coming into the traps because they are producing those digestive enzymes. And when I say that people are using the pitcher plants for all of these things, these are the unopened pitchers. So before the pitchers open, they already have digestive enzymes in them, and people can pop open the lids and then use that liquid. There's only about 20 years ago, there was maybe 90 Nepenthes discovered and written about, and in the past 20, 25 years, lots of different species have been discovered, and that's because a lot of them are found in the mountains on very hard to get to mountains. So if you find a mountain that nobody has traversed, you can probably go there and you can find your own Nepenthes and name it after you. When you're buying a Nepenthes, you should ask your person who's selling them if it is a Highlander or if it is a Lowlander. Highlanders live on the top of the mountain, so that's what they want to experience. They want to experience high humidity, and they want to experience 70s and 80s during the day, and they want to experience a 10 to 20 degree drop at night. And people who are serious about Highlanders, they'll grow them in terrariums or glass containers. And then at night, they'll give them ice packs, cooling systems, air conditioners, refrigeration systems to cool them down to the 50s every day. Now, if you live maybe in the center of the country, of the US, or maybe even a little more north, you could probably grow them outdoors for much of the year and they'll be okay. Or if you live in Miami, a lowlander would probably be more suitable because they like it 80 to 90s during the day, high humidity, and then they pretty much like that temperature year round, at night as well. But if it drops down to the 60s, they'll still be okay. So there's two like distinct groups, Highlanders and lowlanders, but people have also been recently hybridizing them. So they've been crossing Highlanders with lowlanders, which gives you a plant that can handle a larger range of temperatures, which is good for people who grow them indoors or outdoors part of the year during the summer and then indoors in the winter. They, unlike all the other plants, do not like wet feet. So they just want their soil to be moist, but do not let them sit in water. The best substrate, the best growing medium the easiest one is just pure sphagnum or just peat moss and perlite. You can also do a lot of these mixes, where you include things that orchids like to grow in, but the easiest one is just sphagnum or just peat moss and perlite. Here's a different species and hybrids. This is called Nepenthes burkii. It gets a pretty good sized trap. It has these beautiful flared, this is called a peristome. There's these little flared peristomes with the splotches. This is called Nepenthes ampullaria. And these have these tiny little short squat pitchers, and they are often used for the cooking. And do you see how these lids are quite smaller than those other pictures that I was showing you? Scientists believe that the ampullaria are turning into stop eating bugs. I guess they would be, they're starting to eat detritus. They're starting to eat other leaves. They're trying to eat other plants, which is an interesting route of evolution. There's another ampullaria. This one's called lime twist. This serial number is from a popular grower in Sri Lanka. And people who collect Nepenthes are always interested in the serial number. They like to collect them all. So this one's called lime twist with this beautiful inward peristome and this short little squat pitcher. Here's this beautiful wings. Bicalcarata is one of my favorite. It's the ones that has fangs. And what makes them even scarier is that their fangs drip nectar, which makes it look like they're just drooling over their prey. And I was the co-president of the Western New York Carnivorous Plant Club. And we met once a month. And when we met once a month, I would cover a plant in the news. And it was always easy to find a carnivorous plant in the news, which is kind of surprising that so many researchers are working on carnivorous plants. So I wanted to share some of my favorite stories. The first one is about biomimetics and mimicry in nature. And we actually talked about this at the last webinar that we did, how that author is writing a book about biomimetics and how scientists are copying nature to spearhead science, which is pretty exciting. So a couple of years ago, Joanna Eisenberg at Harvard, she studied the chemical structure of Nepenthes and was trying to figure out how are Nepenthes so slippery? How do bugs and animals slip so easily? So what was that slippery surface? She replicated that, and now she has created a material that is used for frictionless free blood transfusions, oil transfusions, and self-cleaning windows. The next thing that I found in the news was about, look at these headlines. Bat uses pitcher plant as toilet and the plant benefits. And killer plants feed, they're feeding on bat feces. So this pitcher plant no longer catches and traps bugs. These little Hardwick's woolly bats, they sleep on the roof of the pitcher plant. They go to the bathroom when they're sleeping. Their fecal material, their poop, goes inside the trap. And plants that have bats sleeping on them, that are pooping in their traps, they're getting 34% more nitrogen, which is making their traps bigger and their leaves healthier. And the last little bit of, this is second to last, this is kind of a sad story. This is the endangered great tit of England, and sadly, one of them went into a pitcher plant. And this is just a couple of years ago. This is only the second time recorded that a plant has eaten a bird. Most of them eat small rodents or, as we know, really tiny insects, invertebrates, things like that. And I think this might be the last news one. You know how the government, it's very difficult for the government to do things right, but just in the past 10 years or so, the House and the Senate made poaching Venus flytraps a felony. And you can get a $10,000 fine and you can be put in jail. And Venus flytraps cost between the common ones cost between $5 and $15. And a lot of times when I'm selling plants, people will come up to me and say, I used to be able to buy a Venus flytrap for 25 cents. And that was back in the 70s when they were being taken from the wild. So now people can clone them. They can grow them with tissue culture because we don't want to be taking from the wild, of course. And people who take from the wild can get pretty big fines. And I just saw in the past year, somebody was put in prison for a bit because they were stealing Venus flytraps from the wild. In Florida, I offer different workshops. And like we started this presentation, I have written for TED Ed for a few times. I've published 4 videos with them, which means I write the script. And I do have one about carnivorous plants. And I'm going to just leave it there. We can share the link because of time. And if you wanted to learn more about carnivorous plants, you should check out the International Carnivorous Plants Society. They are very active on Facebook. They have a website with lots of resources. The benefit of becoming a member is that you get access to their seed bank where people send in seeds and you can contribute to conservation through that way. And the other thing is that quarterly newsletter that they put out is filled with scientific articles and people's findings and hobbyists reporting on how they're growing their plants. If you're interested in purchasing plants, you can go to my website or my Facebook page. I have over 1,000 carnivorous plants for sale. You can visit different garden centers and plant sales. And if you see these, the bottom left, you've probably seen these at Home Depot or Lowe's or like those big box stores. The carnivorous plants in these little plastic containers, we call them death domes. And it's not because of the company. The company is great, but once they get to the big box stores, the gardeners are either drying them out, or if they are watering them, they're not watering them enough. And sadly, the water that they're providing them doesn't have, it's not pure. It probably has chlorine and fluoride and minerals and salts, which carnivorous plants can't handle. So if you can find this company at a nursery that they know what they're doing, I still recommend that. Or you could reach out to your local garden center. And like Bertha said, if you buy a copy of my book, which unfortunately doesn't have anything to do with carnivorous plants, but it does have to do with gardening and cultivating community and homesteading. For the next 24 hours, I am donating all of the profits to TIES, which is it's a free education resource for teachers. And some of the poems in there, they talk about farm to fork recipes. There's a poem called Considerate Cats. There's one about saving heritage breeds, raising seedlings, raising free-range animals and children, saving money. And then it's a poetry book, so there's a poem called 2P or Not 2P. And with that, I thank you very much. And Bertha?
Hi, Lou. I am back. That was great.
Thank you.
There's a few things I'd ask, but I want to ask the questions other people ask. One that's a quick answer you could give is, will you have plants for sale when you speak at the Think and Drink at Bishop?
I will not. It's against their policy, but I am only 30 minutes away from them.
Okay. Well, I could put you in touch with the person who asked that question, Kat Hutchinson, after this, if you guys like to get in touch. What is the biggest thing that a pitcher plant has eaten? And then I saw the question and then you immediately showed that poor little bird, but recorded, what's the biggest thing we know that a pitcher plant has eaten?
Probably a rat or a shrew. But
okay,
most people who grow the Nepenthes, they usually will keep that organism in there just for a couple of days because then it gets really smelly.
Okay. And that question was from another Kenny, by the way.
Oh, wow.
And this question is from Jenny V. If pitcher plants produce quinine, that's the malaria stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. What was the question?
Do they produce it?
Oh, good question. I'm not too sure. But I didn't really mention this, but I don't know if, for me, it's an easy leap. Darwin did not think this was an easy leap. Plants, non-carnivorous plants, they can absorb nutrients through their leaves. That's what foliar feeding is. So if you go to the store, you buy foliar feed, you spray your plants, they benefit from that. They can absorb nutrients from it. So for me, it's not a big leap for a plant that has like a slight curve in their leaf to form this funnel and maybe start funneling rainwater and then funneling the nutrients down. And people are still doing a lot of genome work and figuring out who's related to who and what non-carnivorous plants are maybe evolving towards carnivory.
Okay, here's your next. I like this question. It's from Natalie B. What is your favorite type of plant, you personally? And you might have mentioned this at the beginning, saying honeydew, but which is the easiest to take care of?
Yeah, the easiest to take care of is Cape Sundew, Drosera capensis. And my favorite carnivorous plant, it does change yearly, but my current favorite ones are the Aldrovanda, which are the fully aquatic Venus flytrap type. So they have these little whorls and they float around, and I have them living in a large tub. I have about 20 of them, and I starved my first one last summer. I only had it for a couple of weeks, and then it died. And I was talking to a lot of people, and they said that's because I wasn't giving it enough pond water, and it ate everything that was in there. It ate all the little microscopic infauna. So now that I have a lot of them, I've been going to a local pond to make sure that they're being fed sufficiently.
Wow, this is as much work as my new puppy. Is it typically the, quote, attraction zone that will illuminate when a UV light shines on it? That one's from Jenny V.
Oh, good question. For the Nepenthes, which are the Asian pitcher plants, they have two different types of pitchers. They have one that they're called upper pitchers and then lower pitchers. Upper pitchers are the ones that are up in the trees, and then the lower ones are the pitchers that touch the ground, and then they form little chubbier pitchers. And the ones that are up in the trees, the upper pitchers, they give off more UV, and scientists think that is to attract the flying insects.
Okay, cool. Well, that's the majority of the questions, and we are rounding off the hour here, so I think that's a good point to stop. I put the link for Kenny's website and specifically the link to this book. I want to read the one about cats now again. Right there back in the chat. We had a very active chat today, Everybody was awesome in there, answering a lot of questions and talking to each other and following you. So that was a really great audience that we had today. I want to thank you for doing this for Ties. Everybody, we're moving our videos. We had a wonderful turnout when we moved it to YouTube. So this one will be on YouTube very soon, probably tomorrow. And that way more and more people can view it. We got 4,000 views on the last one. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. And I want to thank Kenny once again and give him the last word.
Thank you very much. Jenny V is defending her PhD thesis tomorrow.
Oh, okay. I was like, wow, she's got a lot of good questions in here. Now I know why.
And once she is crowned doctor, she said she'll do a webinar for us.
Oh, yay! And everybody, please stay. Thank you for saying that. I've already put them on our webinar page, Crowdcast. After spring break, Miami spring break, which is in a couple weeks, we have the Evolution of the Human Brain, parts 1 and 2 with Dr. Mark Reamer from Michigan State University. I saw the presentation. I invited him to present for us. It's going to be a great one. So I hope you'll all be joining us on April 9th is the first one for that, everybody. So please come back, and everybody have a good night.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.